Hello everyone, this is the fifth lecture for Global Business Environment. In this lecture we're talking about another aspect of the global business environment, which is globalisation. We're exploring some of the issues around it and talking more about how it is some of the economic concepts we've talked about so far in the module are applied in this situation. In particular, we're going to talk about some definitions, a brief little bit of history, some of the rationale as to why we would have globalization and why trade exists. Then we'll talk a bit about multinational corporations. And finally, we'll look at some of the critiques as well of globalization. As I said last week, in weeks 4, 5 and 6, we're looking at more applications of economic theory and exploring a particular aspect of the global business environment in more detail. So as this week is globalization, we'll be asking some questions around some of the positive and negative implications of that phenomenon. In particular, the seminar will focus upon some of the questions around who's been a winner and who's been a loser, kind of what the benefits and costs are of globalization. And we'll talk a little bit about why this might have occurred as well. All of this, of course, can then be used as material for a presentation around this topic for your assignment, which you need to submit in week 7. I've already put up a submission link for your group members onto the module page as well. So you can put your module, your group members into that link, and your seminar tutor will talk to you about that as well in your seminar this week. So last week we looked beyond some discussions of competition, supply and demand, and we looked at examples of how many of the biggest markets in the world actually function. We discussed sort of regulation and the role of the state in ensuring that markets don't go below a minimum threshold of quality or benefit for broader society. This is very similar to this week's as well in that sense. However, globalization is one of those phenomena that's actually shaped and formed the world around us. I'm sure that I'll demonstrate this more clearly in the on-campus lecture on Thursday, when I sort of might refer to something, the building we're in, for instance, as having been born of globalization itself. The seminar this week will be looking at particular cases and looking at some examples and asking some questions about globalization. So in terms of definitions of globalization, I'll put a link into the module page for a House of Commons report which recently went through what globalization is, what it really means for the UK, and how we can therefore interact with it as policymakers. In particular, the chief economist of the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, came up with a really neat description of it, which is that in his opinion, it's a process towards closer economic integration of markets, how markets can work closer together for overall benefit of all. Linking back a bit again to that kind of idea of social benefit and social costs we talked about last week. This is channeled through the trade in goods and services, mobility of capital, and mobility of labour as well. There are several different dimensions of globalisation which I think are worth thinking about. There's obviously the economic, which we're talking about mainly in this module. There's political, i.e. governments and kind of institutions growing globally to actually make things work much better and more stably. There's cultural, things we see and look around us, the things we think about, the music and the kind of art we enjoy around us as well. And finally, there's technological, the way that technology is disseminating is much, much more coherent and more homogeneous now. And that's been quite different to how it was in the past, where we saw very different regional emphases around technology development. There's a question regarding who pushes it forward. There are market drivers regarding this, i.e. those particular markets that want to kind of push things together. There may be economies of scale from doing that as well. If you have bigger markets, you have more opportunity to work and share one product across those larger markets. There are cost drivers. There may be advantages to getting things from particular countries, maybe costs less to maybe get a certain product from one country as opposed to another country, which leads to trade, leads to closer integration, leads to more globalization. Government drivers actually push forward some of these political and cultural aspects as well. In European studies, we talk about neo-functionalism as being a theory which explains how governments incrementally make decisions which lead to closer and closer integration between their behaviours and between institutions. The idea that you have little steps all the time, and the next step is led on to as a result of previous steps you've made. There may also be ideological positions as well. People may just think globally and they want to engage with ideological positions which are more globally focused and more globally coherent. Sometimes this is called cosmopolitanism. Finally, there may also be competition drivers. Perhaps there are areas where there's global advantage for businesses, for companies, for countries to work together to actually offset some of the competition from other regions. A great example of that would be the way that European countries have worked together to maybe offset some of the pressures from the Americas or from the rise of cheap manufacturing in China. Globalization is born of the need or the wish to trade. So therefore we need to think about, why do we bother trading in the first place? What is trade about? Well, the early economist David Ricardo suggested that countries should actually specialise in producing those goods that they are best at producing, that they have a comparative advantage over other countries in producing. I think thinking back, one of his examples was kind of sherry or port or wine from Mediterranean countries, and then wool and kind of other cloths and textiles from northern European countries. Those different regions had specializations in those different products, and therefore trading them gave them a comparative advantage over not trading them. As a result, overall productivity is actually enhanced because we're all doing what we're best at, therefore we're able to make more or overall from doing that. Ricardo's model, however, assumes that there are relatively few factors of production. He doesn't really integrate some of the more complex issues we now see in the global economy. He doesn't really engage with things like technological development. He's very much looking at labour productivity and to an extent land as a productive facet. It's not about manufacturing in that context. What I have on screen here is an example, or a worked example, of what Ricardo was referring to. I've got two countries producing two different products, computers and wheat. Country A can produce a ratio of computers to wheat of 0.6, i.e. it is more productive in terms of computers than it is in terms of wheat. Country B can produce more wheat than it can do computers. The overall production capacity, if you just pumped all of your work into producing computers for country A, would be 1,000 units. If you produced wheat, it would be only 600 units. So in terms of overall productivity, it's less useful and there's less production overall if country A produces wheat. So let's have a look at what the optimum situation would be if we actually had trade between these two countries. We're going to assume in this scenario that whatever we produce, we also consume. So if there is a total production capacity of 1,000 computers and 800 tons of wheat, respectively, for each of the two countries, then they can trade this and have 800 computers and 200 tons of wheat for country A and 600 tons of wheat and 200 computers for country B. By specialising, they're able to maximise what they achieve rather than wasting some productive capacity upon something that they're less optimised at producing. Now, of course, this presumes that both computers and wheat are both of the same utility to the different countries. Technology isn't included. And again, just to reiterate, labour is the only thing that's really included in this situation. What it means overall, though, is the principle is that we should aim to actually produce what we are best at. What this looks like on a graph is often called the production possibility frontier. And what I've got here graphed out is the optimum point at which the two countries overlap, where you see country A and country B producing their optimum levels. And we can see on the graph that there's very much like the curves we've talked about before, the equilibrium and the optimum levels in those curves. Production possibility frontiers also have optimum levels as well. So now let's look at globalization in a historical context. Globalization is not purely a modern phenomenon. It's often referred to as being such, and as a term it has been referred to as such in the last few decades, but it's been a long-standing historical fact. The ancient Greeks were the first people to commonly be talked about as having actually traded across the entire globe. Now, for them, the globe was a lot smaller than it is now for us, but their region, they'd actually managed to cover all the known world with their trade routes. The Silk Road is a great example of a pan-Asian trade route between the Mediterranean and North Africa right across to China. And that was a continental network of integrated trade and diplomacy. The two were linked at the time. And quite often, this linkage of trade and diplomacy is referred to as being mercantilism. People are now talking again about the rise of neo-mercantilism, this new linking of trade and politics being important in global affairs. We saw Islamic trade routes from North Africa coming across to the Mediterranean and right across to Southeast Asia as well. They were kind of very globalized at the time, and again, in the context of what was global then. And later we saw European colonization of the Americas and Australia, leading to exploitation of those markets and those regions as well. Moving forward a little bit, 19th century globalization saw a massive acceleration as a result of steam power and industrial productivity. We saw technological advances actually lead the way in terms of how we would globalize and link with other regions. A lot of the trade routes that we talked about in that kind of historical context became very established as well. And this is also where some of the most profound changes in trade routes and trade linkages have also been cemented as well. We see some of these trade routes still in existence now. Some of the canals and some of the kind of like the big ways of getting things around the globe were established at this time. Alongside this, 1815 to 1870 saw relative peace in Europe, and as a result of that, there was more and more trade between those states, and they started to link with the outer world more coherently as well. So you saw the establishment really of that kind of early European cooperation starting to be fermented at that point. I think it's worthwhile now thinking about what happened in the 20th century. We had the two global wars, and then after the Second World War, we started to see the establishment of new political kind of institutions, new political structures globally that actually fermented what was at the time called the Cold War. And this led to a kind of bipolar world. So the globe was split into two spheres of influence. Those areas which believed in kind of free market economy, liberalism, democratic principles. And the other pole was the kind of East, the Soviet sphere of influence, which looked towards the command aspects of economic production, to sort of control the economic production in a way which would lead to socialist outcomes and communist outcomes for those countries. I've put a table on the screen here which just kind of gives a very rough outline of what a command economy looks like compared to a free market economy. So command economies are these communist areas, the Soviet kind of sphere of influence. The free market area was obviously the West, it's Europe, it's Americas and so on. And we see resource allocation as being one of the first things as highlighted, because under a command economy, the government makes decisions about what to produce. Under a free market economy, it's left to the market, it's left to supply and demand, it's left to the invisible hand to guide what should be produced in that economic context. We see some other things such as competition, for instance. Under a command economy, there is no real sort of free will for competition to arrive, because competition has been seen as being potentially negative for society. As a result, it's limited or non-existent. We almost have a monopoly of production by the government and by government-controlled industries. Under a free market economy, the principle is you should encourage competition between businesses and look towards that to optimize production overall. So therefore, finally, consumer choice under a command economy is very limited, whereas in a free market economy, it's much more open. Moving forward to 2024, we now see that this dichotomy still exists, but in a new way. What would be described as being a communist state is generally described as being something that's politically aligned, i.e. the politics is unitary. It's not about having a a total control of the economy. So communist states include China, Vietnam, Laos, Eritrea, Turkmenistan, Cuba. These all have particular political structures which does not have competition in terms of political actors and political parties. Command economies now are very few globally, and I did struggle to find these examples. But essentially, we're talking about North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela to an extent, Libya and Iran to an extent again, i.e. there is very little public ownership of businesses in those regions. I think Iran is a bit of a border example. Belarus, again, there may be some case to say it's not a command economy in the same way anymore. Just to continue this theme, 20th and 21st century, we're now in this kind of post-World War II situation. We have international cooperation, international institutions like the WTO, which led from the GATT agreement, which actually seeks to structure global trade. We have more and more interconnectedness now the Cold War has finished, and there's more and more kind of opportunities for trade and growth across the world. We do have a new polar system being created in terms of how different economic structures are operating, but this is again more of a political emphasis. I think what's been very interesting in the last 2 years has been the forced withdrawal of Russia from the global economic trading system and global monetary system, and that's led to some quite big choices for multinational corporations. What we can say though, however, is that modern communications and transportation have really led to a truly global world, not just for a trading elite, but also for individuals like you and I as well. So supporters of globalization suggest that there's a huge benefit in optimizing productivity, therefore efficiency, therefore resource allocation, therefore overall we're producing more. And that can lead to, and has led to, falling poverty globally. We have seen the overall level of global poverty fall in the last 50 years. It's been really positive in that respect. If we have closer ties between countries, we have more political more political drivers towards having less conflict internationally, because we don't want to disrupt our profitability and our comfortable lives, which are resulting from global trade. We also have greater economies of scale as well, whereby we are able to have more and more complex products which are able to be produced at a price we can all afford. I think one of the most amazing things that's happened in my lifetime has been the way that we can all now afford mobile phones. It's a common commodity, whereas when I was a child, it was a real edge case outlier that was when you had a mobile phone. Flip side is, critics suggest that increasing inequality and concentration of wealth has been caused by globalization. So even though fewer people are poor, a smaller number are mega rich. And that's going to be a real issue in terms of that kind of disparity between who's setting the agenda globally going forward. Can democracy really function when a handful of people have all the actual economic power and it doesn't reside within countries and it isn't linked to the democratic process anymore? We also see exploitation of the factors of production, in particular labour, but also we're exploiting more and more areas of the world which maybe should be left alone. The Amazonian rainforest, for instance, we're seeking all the time to extract the value from that rainforest, deforesting that area, actually causing long-term global changes to our environment as well. Thirdly, there's an ideologically neoliberal emphasis to globalization, i.e. it is politically driven. It is about an ideological position that we should have free markets. It's not respecting individuals. It's not respecting democratic principles within countries. It's imposing something from the West upon those states which it may not suit. It may not suit particular lifestyles, particular people's will in terms of how they want to live their lives and run their countries. Finally, cultural homogeneity. The idea that everything is getting more and more samey. We're all watching the same Marvel films. We're all wearing the same Nikes and the same Levi jeans. We're all becoming more and more similar. And that destroys some of the uniqueness regarding millennia old cultures that have taken all this time to grow. We're losing some of the uniqueness about each country and each nation state. Companies that work in a global way are usually called multinational corporations or transnational corporations. Transnational usually refers to one or two kind of cross-border instances, whereas multinational is this idea about these truly global businesses. They're sometimes referred to as being the kind of end game for large businesses. While they're multinational, however, they're not without a home base. And I think that's one of the things that the financial crash told us, is that ultimately these big businesses still need somewhere to live, and they still at some point need to rely upon the nation state to bail them out when something really goes wrong. On the screen here, I've got an example of an interesting chart which shows the top countries, the top companies in 2024 and how they've actually developed over time. If I look forward in terms of the timeline here to September, we can see the market capitalization changes continually throughout the year as these big companies vie for who's going to be the leader in terms of their overall market value. The market value being their shareholder value, their expectations of their productivity, eventually leading to Nvidia in September time becoming the first $3 trillion company. When multinationals move into a country, they decide to use that, access that market. The money they put into that country to invest in infrastructure like Amazon warehouses, like I've got on the slide here, is called foreign direct investment. And there's great competition between different countries and different markets to actually attract foreign direct investment. People want multinationals to come to them to actually bring some of their investment to their country. Making accommodations, therefore, for multinational corporations is very common, such as tax breaks. The great example would be the Amazon warehouse in the northeast near Newcastle. The land was going to be zoned in a particular way which would attract a high level of taxation for whatever was going to be based there. That level of taxation was, however, waived for Amazon to be based there. So they got a tax break to be based there. And it's very difficult, therefore, to balance out the negative outcomes from having these big infrastructure projects based somewhere and the potential impact for local lifestyles, balancing that against the potential for employment, potential for economic growth, potential for maybe lower prices for consumers. There's also an expectation that practices could be shared across the company, but this also has a tension against the way that local businesses are expected to operate. For example, labour rights. In the UK, we have particular protections for unions, particular protections for people working in large companies, which maybe Amazon isn't used to having to adhere to. So that's another tension that actually happens when multinationals move into a country. And this is, of course, a balance between the marginal social benefits versus the marginal social costs of any action. There are some obvious horrors for the host country. There's some real issues regarding what might happen to the host country when a multinational corporation comes to their area. It may displace burgeoning domestic producers. So if you have somebody like Amazon come and base themselves in the UK, will that actually drive out other burgeoning online retailers, which could be a very productive thing for the country to actually have its own version of? They may also import the majority of the factors of production. That's a real issue. For instance, labour. There's a big issue regarding construction in European Union countries and the rights of local workers to actually work and requirements to work for local workers to be used on construction projects. Whereas multinational corporations come to do these projects, they want to bring their own labour instead because they're a lot cheaper. Profits may be going overseas rather than reinvested into the country. And that's linked in many ways to what's called transfer pricing. Transfer pricing is where, even though I'm buying something in the UK, for example, the actual transaction occurs somewhere else. Or you may have sub-national national units of a country, of a company, for instance, borrowing or buying things from other areas within the company which are in other countries. A great example is Starbucks and the fact that they put most of their transactions regarding the coffee through Ireland, because there's a cost advantage to doing that. There's a tax break advantage, even if it means a transaction occurring in another country. We may also see competition between states, between countries, pushing down standards in a scrabble to get this multinational corporation foreign direct investment. Ignoring sustainability issues, classic example, big multinationals not really seeing a big issue with some pollution happening locally because it doesn't affect them necessarily in a direct way. Their shareholders don't see it, so therefore they're not concerned by cleaning things up. And finally, for instance, particularly in the case I mentioned regarding Amazon, if you have a non-Amazon warehouse, you may or distribution center, they may well be quite an employee-intensive, a labor-intensive site. You might have lots of people moving boxes around, driving forklift trucks. When you have new technological developments, such as a big Amazon warehouse, a lot of it is automated. And so therefore, it's displacing economic activity without providing employment, which of course is a negative for the host country. This has been quite a long lecture, so I'm going to finish off by just mentioning global supply or value chains. The global network of businesses and these multinational corporations are fed by an interconnected web of supply chains where goods and services are passed between different companies all the way down to the consumer. And we'll talk about this in another couple of weeks as well. Sometimes these networks or chains are referred to as being about value-adding processes, in which case they're referred to as value chains. Some more recent work is actually looking at the fact that these chains are not linear, they're incredibly complex. And every level of the production of supply to the consumer may actually have multiple different levels and multiple different actors involved, leading to almost constellations of value-adding companies all interacting to provide a product to the consumer. Some of these chains and value systems are around very well established linkages. Even these historic supply chains and supply routes through, for instance, the Mediterranean or around the Cape of Good Hope and whatever. But others are rapidly changing as a result of technology changing. For instance, things like additive manufacturing has led to changes in how people are quickly developing new products and new items to use for machinery, for instance. Offshoring is where we move things out of a country into another country in order to be able to produce it more cheaply. And that's the essence of this idea of multinationals using foreign labour perhaps to produce something as opposed to making it in the country they're selling it in. But there's been an advantage recently perceived as a result of the pandemic, as a result of the increasing cost of these global chains. There's been an increasing recognition that actually onshoring, bringing things nearer to the market where things are sold, may actually lead to a cost advantage. I.e., rather than making something in China and selling it in the UK, maybe we should make it in the UK to actually bring it closer, because actually shipping it around the world costs just too much. Okay, in conclusion, globalization is a very dynamic thing. It's a process rather than a defined point in time. It continues to rewrite the business environment. It's one of the most active facets of it. I think it's really interesting, and it affects every aspect of modern life. It's one of those things that's embedded within all of our psyches now. There are variable effects and there's plenty of criticism. Overall, we can see that globalization has been a positive force for societal growth, and it's led to a reduction in poverty and led to potentially lots of benefits for society. But it doesn't mean it's always been good. And I think what's interesting will be in the seminars this week is to hear what your opinions are going to be and hear about what your opinions are going to be in the presentations you're going to do as well, and kind of weigh up that argument regarding how positive globalization has actually been in reality and what your lived experience of that has been as well. Thank you.